Good evening. Every generation faces a threat to its health and survival. For our generation, that threat is AIDS, so far incurable, still spreading. The virus can be contracted through the use of dirty needles by drug abusers, through sexual intercourse, heterosexual or homosexual. But there's been another route of transmission, the National Health Service itself. That's the focus of our film tonight, the National Health Service treatment which gave the AIDS virus to British haemophiliacs. Haemophiliacs suffer from a rare blood disorder which can be described simply as spontaneous bleeding. They lack the vital agent which makes their blood clot. Haemophiliacs are male, but women are carriers, so it passes down through the generations. It affects 5,000 people in Britain today. In many cases, staying alive can depend on daily injections of the missing blood clotting factor, in its time a medical breakthrough. And yet, it's through this essential treatment that large numbers of haemophiliacs have been infected with the AIDS virus, the fatal factor.
Alan White suffers from a rare blood condition, haemophilia. Until recently, his was an outstanding success story. He has a young family, a career, everything to live for. But through his National Health Service treatment, he's been infected with the AIDS virus. Today, Alan and his wife Christine have come to prepare for the possibility of his premature death.
What's your present age?
34.
34, right. You're married to Christine, you've got 2 children, haven't you? 2 daughters, I think you said. Now, I understand that some time ago you were diagnosed as being HIV positive. Is that correct? And because of that simple fact in itself, you've decided that you want to get your affairs in order and get everything tidied up for your wife and your family.
Yeah.
Now, I've prepared a will here, based upon the facts you've told me.
I think with any terminal illness, the ilder you get, it's more difficult to face. To me, not only is it preparing for when I die, but it could mean that I'm going to be seriously ill for a couple of years. I might be lucky and not develop AIDS. No one knows. No one can give me any cast iron guarantees.
So very simply then, that is the will. It will all to Christine. Thereafter, it will be for the benefit of the children. I'm just asking you now to sign this on the basis of the information given.
Signing a will, it's almost like concrete in the fact that I'm going to die. When you've actually begun to make plans, it makes it very difficult then to actually shake off that idea. What have you done at school?
So far, Alan has no clinical symptoms of full-blown AIDS, but over the last year, his immune system has shown signs of weakness.
The whole thing of being HIV positive, it means that the immune system isn't fighting off everyday bugs. A common cold will floor me. Flu can literally leave me in bed for 2, 3, 4 weeks. Often the outward symptoms are not necessarily the real indicators of, true state of health. That's why I have regular blood tests, really.
A close check is kept on Alan's condition through regular trips to the Haemophilia Centre at Bradford Royal Infirmary. Although none of his family are infected, they accompany him on his visits.
Hello, Mr.
Alan White. See Dr. Parrop here.
To go to the end of the corridor, turn left and just take a seat.
How have things been then?
Not too bad, apart from the last couple of days, with this sort of flu feeling again. Sickness and basically just feeling rough again.
I see.
Which I've not had for a few weeks.
How long have you had this?
It's just the last 3 days.
Certain times when I know that he's ill, when he goes, I'm wandering while he's there. I try and treat it as routine because, we know that they'll tell us if there is anything.
Okay. I just want you to take some deep breaths through your mouth.
Alan White was infected with HIV through treatment for his bleeds. Haemophiliacs bleed because they lack a vital blood clotting agent. They bleed internally into joints and muscles. 20 years ago, patients could expect severe arthritis and early death. But in the early 70s, their lives were transformed by a new drug to treat life-threatening bleeds. The product was a clotting agent called Factor VIII. Britain's haemophiliacs could now treat themselves at home with a simple injection. Specialist units like the Royal Victoria in Newcastle pioneered the life-saving treatment.
I've been working with my colleagues with haemophilia for over 20 years, and in that time we've seen a revolution in medical care. We were seeing kids growing up, going to normal schools, taking normal careers, competing with their peers at all levels of society, marrying, having families of their own, things that were unthinkable for the majority of people with haemophilia 20 years ago. And they could expect to live a normal length of life. And then AIDS came along and changed the whole scene.
Factor VIII was the lifesaver that became the fatal factor. The route of transmission was simple. Donations of blood and plasma, the source material for Factor VIII, came from donors who were themselves infected with the AIDS virus. The virus withstood the freezing process involved in the making of Factor VIII and found its way into the final product. The patients became the victims of the new virus. 1,200 people, 60% of Britain's severe haemophiliacs, are now infected. 54 have already died of AIDS.
The further you move into the epidemic, the more patients, no matter who they are, haemophiliacs or other people, seem to develop AIDS-related disease. And here, for instance, something like, well, certainly over 50% of our patient population are showing physical signs.
I think this is probably the greatest medical tragedy of modern times. We had high hopes for the new generation of haemophiliacs. They are the first generation of patients who have decent joints, and the outlook for them seemed very good.
Many of those infected are children and teenagers. Ian Baird is one of them. So far, he has no symptoms of full-blown AIDS, but his haemophilia is so severe that much of his life is spent on crutches or confined to his bedroom. The tragedy for the Baird family is even greater. Their 13-year-old son, Walter, is also a haemophiliac and also infected.
Sit. When haemophilia itself was bad enough, to get that on top of it, devastating. My wife goes to her bed quite early. I sit up at night and it haunts me. We're very close, the two boys. When we found out that Walter was HIV positive, we were told Ian about it. Ian was really more upset about Walter being HIV infected than he himself having it. It shattered Ian that we Walter had it. And that's the truth, it really did. How did you go on this morning? What kind of treatment did you get?
Just fever and painkiller.
At first, when we heard about AIDS and that, we didn't really relate it to our sons. Until information came that haemophiliacs in America were being contaminated. Then we found out both our boys were HIV positive. And the strain really has been just about too much. How my wife copes with it, I don't know. I find it difficult to cope with.
What effect has it had on the family?
Close to destroying us, breaking up our marriage. So really it's a disaster. A disaster.
Ian and Walter were infected through their National Health Service prescriptions for Factor VIII. Their mother, Margaret, unknowingly injected them.
I always say it's another day making up stuff. If you get a bleed well, you've got to make it up. You've no choice. Life goes on. At the same time, you don't know what future there is for them. And each bottle you pick up, you wonder if it's all right or not. At the same time, you've got to give them treatment to try and stop them from having pain and suffering. Keep the boys alive.
It's become more difficult. She feels now every time she's transfusing them that, you know, she's carrying a wee bit guilt of the fact that she gave him contaminated Factor VIII. I tried to convince her it's nothing to do with her. I mean, it's just not her fault. You can only work with the tools you've been given. The wife's totally innocent of that.
I have to give him an awful lot of loving, touch and feeling. for both boys, not just Walter or Ian, both of them, for what's happened.
We must face reality. I could lose my sons any time. They could start going downhill and eventually die. I feel we've been badly betrayed because my two sons were given on the National Health Service contaminated factor 8, which has resulted in them being AIDS carriers. My sons are paying the price. The cure is killing them.
Most of the infected factor 8 was imported from America. The product was infected because the American donors were carrying the virus. In the early 80s, when American homosexuals were dying of AIDS, the disease began to appear in other groups.
Walter Scott of Trafford, Alabama, is one of 4 haemophiliacs who contracted the disease. Scott is the only one still living. Researchers believe he got it from blood products he must inject to help his blood coagulate.
In January 1983, an eminent American medical journal warned for the first time that factor 8 posed a threat.
I recall reading the article by Jane Deforge in the New England Journal of Medicine describing several haemophiliacs in the United States with AIDS. And this seemed a startling development and one that caused considerable concern because, of course, my own patients had also been transfused with American factor 8.
Deforge warned that treating haemophiliacs with factor 8 might exact a high cost. In Britain, AIDS was still a remote problem. Facts were hard to come by, doctors working in the dark.
In 1983, we had no test. There was no antibody test. We didn't know who was infected. We didn't know the extent of the infection. Above all, we didn't know which blood products were infected. We had grave suspicions about the imported product, but we didn't know if it was safer to change to a British product or, as was suggested, to one of the European products. So we had this dilemma. But above all else, we knew we had to go on treating haemophilia. And we knew that if we dismantled all the treatment that was then available to people with haemophilia, then we would have seen more crippling and more early death.
But by 1983, it was too late for many British haemophiliacs. They'd already been infected in large numbers. The breakthrough came a year later. Scientists developed the first tests for AIDS antibodies. Doctors tested their patients. The results confirmed their worst fears. At Newcastle, more than 50% of severe haemophiliacs were infected.
I described it in 1984 as being like a slow Aberfan. We watched a whole generation of people engulfed by this new virus. And we saw some of our friends, not just patients, die as a result. It's been pretty devastating.
How long is it since you had a shot of factor 8?
Sister Maureen Ferns works alongside Dr. Jones at the Newcastle Centre.
For many months, I could see the look of devastation on the people's face, the parents, the relatives. It was just so painful and hurtful that this could have happened to them. Particularly, I feel very strongly about what it must be like to be the mother of a child who is positive. In one case, the parents asked me if I would be prepared to sit with them and tell the child he was positive. I think that's the most hurtful thing in the whole of my professional career that I've ever had to do. The boy shed a few tears and then started to be very logical and wanted to know, would I die? Will it hurt? Can you make me better? All of those kinds of things.
As far as the adolescents are concerned, I think in many ways they're the most difficult group to look after. They're certainly the most poignant in that they are growing up to discover that it's going to be very difficult for them to find a sexual partner. It means that they can't have children. They will have great difficulty in finding a job. And they begin to learn that they may have a potentially fatal virus infection.
Haemophilia counsellor Patricia Wilkie is attached to the Glasgow Royal Hospital, visiting 17-year-old Ian Baird at his home.
Visiting at home is important. There is not nearly enough counselling facilities for haemophilia patients and their families.
Hello, Margaret. Nice to see you.
Come to see Ian. How is he today?
Not you know.
I've known Ian for just over 2 years in the hospital and coming to visit him at home. How are you today? Goodness.
Yeah.
How are things? Young people know that at the moment there is no cure for AIDS, so they worry about what may happen to them, where they will be looked after, how ill they may become. It is frightening, isn't it? People seem very ill.
That's right.
Yes.
What's all that?
It's often harrowing. You cannot reassure them that they will not develop full-blown AIDS because we do not know what will happen.
They must feel totally isolated. I would say it's mentally it has affected them quite badly.
How?
Well, it leaves them depressed. When they're laid up, especially if they're laid up with a bleed, you know, when they can't get out and about and keep their minds occupied. One thing's always in their mind, the AIDS virus. When is it going to get them?
Severe depression and stress are now common amongst haemophiliacs. Michael is in his late 20s with a young family. He was diagnosed HIV positive in 1985. Since then, he's become a recluse.
I don't want to meet people. I just can't seem to break that barrier of getting to know or being a part of something. Even gone to the extent of shunning my own wife and kids, you know, and going up into the bedroom every night as they come in from school and staying there till they go to bed. At nights I don't sleep thinking and my head gets so full that it's bursting, you know. I feel as if my brain's going to explode with all the problems, and to have to feel this stress and anguish that through no fault of my own. To have to treat my family in such a way. Yeah, I shouldn't have to put up with it. I feel as if I'm helpless the whole time.
These patients are very afraid. They're very afraid of disclosing their HIV status to anybody. And as far as they're concerned, confidentiality is paramount. And this, again, is because of all the hysteria that's been displayed in response to the AIDS epidemic.
I feel as if I shouldn't have to live a secret, but the way society is and the fears they've got, it's just impossible. I'm just scared that if somebody found out and they wanted to be nasty about it. I've heard of other people having this problem, even to the extent of harassment. They could just be funny and treat us as outcasts.
They live, at the moment, so many of these families, in isolation. They're fearful that if it's found out that infection exists there, even though they're no danger to other people, that they will be discriminated against. Society hangs every prejudice that they find convenient onto this banner that we call AIDS. We've had horrid cases of walls being daubed with AIDS is here in families who've just lost somebody.
On this estate in Hartlepool, the family of a dying haemophiliac was victimised. Stephen Longstaff died of AIDS at the age of 20.
Dr. Jones took us in just after Christmas and said he was sorry to tell us that Stephen's going to die. Couldn't do anything. That's when he told us about the AIDS. Terrible disease to see it. He just got weaker and tired till he couldn't do any more. It's terrible to see him go down.
His immune system destroyed by AIDS, Stephen suffered pneumonia and finally cancer of the jaw.
He didn't last 6 months. He died in 3.
The punishment wasn't over for Stephen's parents. They were the victims of fear and discrimination in their own community. Their home was daubed with graffiti.
It'd been done during the night. The wife came in crying. Said, have you seen what you've done outside on the wall? Somebody had written, beware of AIDS in here. Our lives just changed, you know. Even when we speak outside, we're just frightened. You know, you could be going out in the town centre shop and some of them would, you know, look at you and walk away or cross the road. We used to come in and cry. But once in a while we felt like committing suicide.
Stephen Longstaff was almost certainly infected by imported blood products. Factor VIII is made from two sources. The National Health Service manufactures a small amount, but British production has never kept pace with demand. 75% is still imported from American commercial companies. Now all Factor VIII is screened and heat-treated to kill the AIDS virus. Britain's new blood products laboratory at Elstree in Hertfordshire. This year, production of NHS Factor VIII should finally make Britain self-sufficient in the vital product. But it's 10 years too late.
You're not taking this out?
Since the 1970s, successive government health ministers have failed to reduce our dependence on imported Factor VIII.
Well, it can only be as fast as buildings can be set up and equipment purchased. When I made the decision now, some time ago, it was thought that it would take us 3 years. We brought it down to 2 years, and maybe we can improve even on that.
In the early 80s, the government increased its commitment to Elstree, but consistently over the last few years, they still haven't been able to actually deliver what is required, and that means self-sufficiency. Each minister, and there have been 3 or 4 since the initial promise was made, has promised self-sufficiency within 1 or 2 years.
We have planned throughout on the basis that this was going to achieve self-sufficiency. Obviously, 95% self-sufficiency would be disappointing and would contain an element of risk in it, unless we found some new, totally safe source of supply.
Government has a clear moral responsibility. People who were infected with the AIDS virus, who had haemophilia, were infected as a result of their treatment through the National Health Service. The vast majority of them were infected with imported blood products, which, if the UK had been self-sufficient some years ago, many fewer would now be infected. It's a disgraceful delay. It's quite outrageous that when people knew, back in the 70s, that although they didn't know about AIDS, they knew that the source of the product was inherently risky.
Long before AIDS, there were warnings that commercially obtained Factor VIII might be more likely to cause infection. In America, where donors sold their blood plasma for cash, some of the source material for Factor VIII came from the lowest stratum of US society, where infection was likely to be higher.
By the mid-1970s, we already knew that Factor VIII could contain viruses, in particular hepatitis B or serum hepatitis. Some companies were using a very large pool size, perhaps up to 12,000 donors per batch. So it only needed one of those donors to have a virus for all the recipients of that batch of Factor VIII to potentially be infected. So we knew by the mid-1970s that the American product was potentially more risky than the British product.
AIDS itself could not have been foreseen, but by the time the virus appeared, Britain had put itself in a vulnerable position.
People looking after patients with haemophilia have been back to government every year since the early 1970s. The slow response of successive governments in putting money into our national blood transfusion service led to a lot of this tragedy, because we know now that 4 times as many people were infected with HIV as a result of transfusion of American blood products.
I do blame the government because they've cut back, and this is what's happened. I mean, how many people's got to die before they do something? People have got to die before they do anything. Stephen, he's had no life. He's only 20-year-old. Some died younger.
Some of the victims and their families are seeking legal advice and may take action against the Department of Health and others. The government says that responsibility is a matter that can only be tested in the courts. Nevertheless, last November, the government did create a hardship fund for victims and their families.
This is not a compensation scheme, and indeed I think that must be made clear. It is a recognition of a special and unique combination of circumstances, and that I am very glad indeed to make. As to the sum of £10 million, then I must say that we did arrive at a broad estimate of a sum that we felt would give significant help to the group affected.
The fund will be administered by the Haemophilia Society. It's less than a third of their original demand.
£10 million is a start, which is something greatly to be welcomed, but long term, over the next 2 or 3 years, it isn't going to meet the needs of the vast majority of people who are going to be affected.
A pittance. An insult, in fact. £10 million between 1,200 people. Assuming it ever gets to the 1,200 people.
The money will not be divided equally. Priority will be given to the bereaved and those dying of AIDS. A family like the Bairds with 2 infected sons are unlikely to receive anything.
There just isn't enough to go around to provide a simple equal payment. The trust fund and the money which we've been given is to alleviate hardship. It is not compensation. We want compensation. We want people to have a payment in recognition of their infection of a dangerous virus through their medical treatment. We have not got that.
The only way my sons will ever get any money out of that is if they start to die with it. Now that's a horrible conclusion to come to, but that's fact.
I shouldn't have to put up with all this financial stress I feel, because I'd like to see my family provided and cared for, and I have to see my family in this poverty. Humiliation it is. And yet it's only been brought on because of the virus. Because before I had hopes that things would improve, but things are getting worse and worse, and there's no end to the tunnel. I can't see an end to the tunnel. I have aunties and uncles and cousins that I can't even afford to visit, to talk to. I've even lived with one of my aunties, you know, like my parents. And financially, it's that bad I can't even go visiting to see them. And the thoughts of anything developing.
When I go fishing with Walter, I picture myself at the same age, the same places. As far as you can. Top of your rod down a wee bit now, and wind, wind, wind. I often wonder if he'll ever be doing the same as I was doing, taking his sons up the water fishing, learning them how to cast a line, things that I took for granted. I'm teaching Walter, but chances are he'll never be able to do the same for his own son.
It's a bitter truth for any parent to face up to, that his child's future has been cut off through the effect of a treatment administered by the state's own health service. The government has set up a £10 million hardship fund, but is it enough? When we contacted the Department of Health and Social Security, this is what they said. It will be for the trustees, not the government, to decide how financial help is to be allocated. Individual needs will vary widely. If used wisely, we believe the £10 million and the income from it will prove adequate to the task. The money has not yet been allocated, so it's premature to suggest that it's too little. So though the government hasn't ruled out an increase in the fund, it's not promising more money. And more money is what the Haemophilia Society wants. If the government thinks an average of £8,000 is adequate, says the Haemophilia Society, to provide for the dependents of those that will die, it makes you wonder if they're living in the real world. And if anything in our film tonight worried you, you can ring a trained advisor on the National AIDS Helpline. It's 0800 567 123. It's open now, it's free, and of course, it's confidential.